Ernest Lawson's Spring Thaw. Ernest Lawson's Spring Thaw is a great example of his recurring theme of rivers. This is evidently one of his favorite themes. He even paired it with snow, another one of his preferred elements to depict. Although he does have some cityscapes and urban paintings, the majority of them are beautiful ode to nature, as he illustrates them rarely touched by humankind. This idea of the intact earth combined with his iconic impressionist style makes this painting an accurate representation of Lawson. There must have been certain events in Lawson's life to make him want to paint the way he does, or even choose landscapes. In fact, in his younger life, he lived in many different places before going to New York, where he began his career. Born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, he quickly moved to Ontario, Canada, and lived there until he was 15. He then moved to Kansas and then to Mexico, where he worked as a draftsman. It was in 1891 where he finally got the sum he needed to move to New York and start taking art classes at the Art Students League. Shortly after, he moved to Connecticut and started taking classes led by John Henry Twachtman and J. Alden Weir, two American Impressionist artists. Many believed it was from these mentors that he got his specific style, not only in his technique but in the settings he chose as well. They all seem to have been fascinated with natural landscapes with very little civilization, which Spring Thaw portrays accurately. Even the color palette is reminiscent of both these artists, but the majority of the paintings resemble Twachtman's, who was known for reviving the techniques used in Japanese paintings, especially in the way he handled the paint strokes. Although an American artist, he spent a lot of time in Europe, while he studied in Munich and Paris. It is when he finished his studies in Paris that his paintings started to develop characteristic muted color palette that was then adopted by Lawson. As for Weir, the similarity to Lawson's work may not be outstanding like Twachtman's, but it is indubitable that he was his mentor. The details are subtler, since although Weir was an impressionist as well, his work was a little more crisp and detailed than Lawson's. For example, the way he handled trees is very similar how Lawson painted them in Spring Thaw. The fragile branches, the dotted leaves, and even the white highlight along the edges of the tree emulate Weir's style. After completing his art classes and establishing his style, Lawson settled down in Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan in 1898, just a few years after electricity was introduced. This new system of electric lighting was announced in 1882, and New York was one of the first states to adopt it. It later expanded into cars and different kinds of machinery. Needless to say, New York was industrializing, and the beautiful nature landscapes Lawson longed for were being replaced by what we know as New York today, a busy skyscraper-filled city. There are very few paintings by Lawson that show the rapid urbanization of the 19th and 20th century, which may imply how he wasn't ready to give up his nature landscapes and was holding on to them. Spring Thaw is just one of many paintings which depict the outskirts of Manhattan, still untouched by mankind. In fact, Spring Thaw and some other paintings by Lawson show some type of civilization in the distance, which could be interpreted as the fusing of the city with the untouched land. Because Lawson's impressionist style was not the approach other American painters were executing at the time, which was very clean and smooth paintings with rarely any visible brushstrokes, he was considered to be going against the norm. European artists such as Monet inspired his style, but Americans at the time were not familiar with these types of paintings. However, he wasn't the only American impressionist who felt different. There were 7 others who felt the same. Eventually, they came together and created a group called the Eight, which the purpose of setting up an exhibition showcasing the work for which they were criticized. Each one of these artists painted something specific for this exhibition, featuring American scenery, but each with their own style. In 1908, their exhibition was the center of attention of all the conservative American tastes. Although they didn't sell as many paintings as they would have hoped for, they created such a scandal that it wasn't until this movement that Lawson's career skyrocketed. Despite him having little success in the past, now the vague brushstrokes and muted color palette became characteristic of him. The eight were talked about all over the media, and it is this fame that may have influenced his future paintings, such as Spring Thaw, to become even more impressionist. The vivid colors he painted before were lost, and now the muted palette took over, as if he weren't afraid anymore to be who he really was. Not only that, the critiques he received before the exhibition might have even driven him to change his style, since it wasn't being accepted, but after the success the eight had, there would have been no way he would replace his uniqueness for something that would have already been done before. This piece was painted somewhere around 1910, shortly after the eighth exhibition, making it very significant in his oeuvre. This calm landscape scene also illustrates two lone rowboats floating over the sharp curve of the river. The darker snow near the bank of the river and some pieces of ice breaking off and floating inwards suggest that the snow is melting. This detail accurately portrays the season transition between winter and spring. The tiny blooming leaves and the fragile trees in the distance also aid in this portrayal. There are also hints of some delicate plants and grass peeking through the rough melting snow, especially near the bank of the river. These may have been either from the previous season or from the coming one, since some look more lifeless than others. The trees on the right-hand corner have some very subtle white detailing of the top of the branches, almost as if it's just recently snowed. Because everything is melting and the season is changing, this piece could be portraying the last snow of the season. The atmospheric perspective makes the scene look foggy, and it almost has a humid feeling to it because of warmer tones of blue he chose. Also, because of his use of warmer tones, this scene looks as if it were sometime in the morning or early afternoon. In fact, there is a very similar painting to this one by the same author, titled Winter Landscape. It almost has the same palette and setting, which seems as if he really liked this area. This would make sense since he lived near this area, as this was painted in the outskirts of Manhattan. Lawson seemed to enjoy cooler palettes, an attribute which Spring Thaw fits into. This one has something extra, however, since the color range is very limited, mainly composed of warm tones of blue, green, and purple. Oranges and off-whites highlight this piece, contrasting the warm green he used before. All of these tones seem to have a touch of gray, as they are somewhat dusty looking. This helped the snow look grittier and emphasizes the look of melting snow, while also making the atmosphere seem humid. The colors in the background appear to have been mixed with more white than those in the front, which not only aids in the use of atmospheric perspective but also gives the piece a somewhat foggy look. Although the colors in Spring Thaw are desaturated, the value in this painting as a whole is very bright. There isn't much contrast in most of the painting, with a couple exceptions. A little less than half of the painting is sky, and the faraway trees and houses with an atmospheric perspective effect which create dimension through the lack of contrast. Although there is dimension to the snow, it isn't dramatic, which may suggest it wasn't intended to be the focus of the piece. The reflection of the trees and the water, however, possess much more contrast than the rest of the painting, automatically leading the viewer's eye to the corner. The eye is then left to the left, following the direction of the stream onto the boat, which has the same amount of contrast. Not only does the boat itself have a lot of contrast, but the reflection does as well. These two elements have the darkest colors in the whole piece, which is crucial for it not to feel dull or boring. In fact, this balances out the light colors and the little variation there is in between. If it wasn't for these two simple elements, the whole painting would be completely different. A technique that goes hand in hand with the color palette is the texture used. It not only suggests more roughness in the snow, but also gives a cloudy look to the sky. In fact, these two elements played a big role in what classified this piece into being one of Lawson's earliest works, since he rarely dated his paintings. His style seemed to progress with the passing of time, and the later works are more smoother looking than those in the beginning of his career. These elements also possess great characteristics of Japanese aesthetics, specifically the broken strokes of paint, which associates with his mentor being Twachtman. Something not many people would see on first glance but still has big significance are the lines used. Although it looks as if the painting is a calm and serene scene, which would typically be characterized by horizontals, it barely has any. Instead, it is mostly composed of diagonals and verticals, which create movement and spirituality. Because of the isolation and the colors used, there is a sense of stability. However, the many diagonal lines give it a subtle movement. The scene comes alive as the eye is guided through the curved stream and then through the tiny houses in the distance that are barely even visible. The rows of skinny trees create vertical lines that guide the viewer's eye up and into the sky, which then fades into negative space. Because the trees are near the bank of the river, there are very crisp reflections on the water, which also lead the viewer to the bottom of the painting where the emerging lifeless plants are. This whole composition could be divided into three parts: the gray sky, the distant hills and houses which have very little contrast, and the part where the stream is most visible, and where there is the most color variation and contrast. There is also a lot of negative space at the top section to balance out the other two. Even though it isn't prominent, it definitely makes that part feel busier than if it was left unused. Because of the combination of different elements, there is a sort of zigzag path that the eye follows, that begins on the river and then moves up out and out into the sky. The focal point seems to be the lower section of the painting, particularly the two rowboats that are calmly floating on the bank of the river. This is achieved because of the isolation of the element and the harsh contrast in comparison to its surroundings. However, the eye bounces from that to the reflection of the trees, which is directly horizontal to the boats. Spring Thaw is not only a beautiful painting itself, but also reflects Lawson's early time of his life. His personality, his influence, and the views towards nature also come across. Most importantly, when seen along with the previous and future paintings by Lawson, his development can be recognized, ranging from the color palette to the techniques used. All these qualities show not only how important Spring Thaw is in Lawson's collection, but to the Impressionist community as well.